So welcome everyone for the 8th AKASHA Conversation. This is now, since last December that we are rolling with this initiative in the AKASHA Foundation. And today we are very happy to welcome Andy. He will present on peer-to-peer learning and care. Before we start with Andy's presentation, just to give you some context about AKASHA Conversations. This is a regular webinar that we started to explore critical questions that are around decentralized social networking and that we feel are related and important to address. We always invite a speaker that informs us and provides his insights into the topic, and we want to inspire open dialogue and action. What is Ethereum world and what we are working on is a new kind of social network. It's a decentralized autonomous social network / platform that should be governed by the people using this. It's not a for-profit social platform or network as we know them today. I mean, in such a sense, it should be a public good, both non-excludable and non-rivalrous though. And you can actually go to akasha.ethereum to play with it. We also have a discourse forum. We want to build some more momentum and community engagement around this topic. So feel free to join. And now, without further ado, I just want to introduce Andy Tudhope, alias Cryptowanderer. And I want to say that Andy, is a real true wanderer between the worlds. He is bridging in the time that we are sharing with him, the time I was able to get to know Andy, the worlds of poetry and computer science and physics. And through this wandering through the crypto world, Andy has gained a deep understanding of and made significant contributions to the world of Ethereum. And he has then put together his majestic wisdom into a beautifully crafted curriculum. And around this curriculum, he built the Kernel Community. And as it's written on the website of the Kernel Community, it is a gift to all of us and a lifelong network of awesome humans that are being built one block at a time. And I was very happy to be in the block 6, that was, I believe, I'm not sure Andy which block, or block 4, that was last fall. And now I'm very happy to welcome you here and learn more and have you share your insights about Kernel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. When you're ready, you can share your screen again and
yes.
Pop over to my slides.
Yes,
because you'll be my helper elf in the background here as
absolutely.
I present from a Barcelona cafe. Thank you everybody for taking the time out of your day to join us. I really, really appreciate you giving us an hour, and please excuse any background noise you might hear from my mic as I present from a cafe somewhere on the streets of Barcelona. As Martin so kindly mentioned, what I'll be talking about today is this notion of care and peer-to-peer learning. The quote that you read on the slides to begin comes from a man called Ivan Illich, who was a Catholic priest and a great critic in the true sense of that word, one who is able to see clearly, talk truly, and never forgets the love which needs to go with perhaps cutting words. And this particular quote, the current search for new educational funnels must be reversed into the search for the institutional inverse, educational webs which heighten the opportunity for each one to transform each moment of living into one of learning, sharing, and caring, comes from an incredible essay called School, the Sacred Cow, and it can be found in a wonderful book of his called Presence. In fact, it comes immediately after another, just one of my favorite essays called The Powerless Church. And in that essay, along with School, the Sacred Cow, Illich is talking about the way in which both educational institutions and religious institutions can think of reforming themselves in order to do away with power and become once more a celebrant of the mystery. This applies equally to learning and to religion or worship, because both are premised on our ability to remain humble in the face of the mysterious and never cease to ask insightful and penetrating questions about what it is that really matters, what our purpose is, where we come from, why we're here. These kind of questions sit at the heart of both deep and lifelong learning, as well as worship. Illich was one of the most clear modern thinkers on this, and you will find all sorts of his wisdom strewn throughout Kernel. So I thought that it was a beautiful place to begin, because not only does it introduce you to one of the thinkers who grounds our own perspective in the world, it also opens up the field a little bit towards thinking about what peer-to-peer learning might really be about outside of the technical specificity of it, which I'll get into this in this call, and points at that which is really worth learning about, which is what gives us purpose, what grounds us in meaning. And I'll try and illustrate some of that as we go through the presentation. But if you'll go to the next slide. I thought while I had your attention and fresh and open minds, I would start with the thing which I really want you to take away from this presentation, which is the simple notion that you should not build community. I think that this is the ultimate trap, and that we often get caught by the narrative that we should all be out to build community, to create connection, to try and bring the world closer together. And I call this a trap specifically because it comes from the modern cultural condition in which we find ourselves as atomized and fragmented individuals who are not, by virtue of where we live and how we are brought up, immediately a part of some given community. And because of that, we yearn for or seek to find places where we can bond with others. But when you set out to build community as a design goal, inevitably it becomes far too self-recursive, and it becomes an exercise in navel gazing. And what I mean by that is that if you look at, for instance, the DAO, this great governance experiment that happened in 2016 on Ethereum, here was a group of people of which I was a part, and which was, wonderful to learn from. But here was a group of people who got together in order to figure out how to govern one another. And that particular impulse is too self-recursive. It doesn't provide the necessary purpose and meaning in order to have lasting and sustainable potential. It doesn't have a good enough raison d'etre for real gathering, right? The emergence of community is what's important, right? And I use that word specifically because community is not a constructed phenomenon. It is an emergent one. And so when you have communities that are built for the sake of being in community, or governments who are created only for the sake of governing, it inevitably turns back on itself in what end up being unhealthy ways. What I'm trying to point out on the slide is that we need some intentional reason for gathering that gives us meaning and purpose. Being in a community is not enough, right? It shouldn't be the design goal of what we're doing. It should be the way we measure our success. The design goal needs to be something far more specific and clear. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that in Kernel, it's enormously simple for us, right? Like the design goal of Kernel is learn together. We learn together. We are a peer-to-peer learning community. And it's really, really important that learning comes before community, because our specific purpose is to craft environments in which people can learn. If healthy community emerges out of that, then we know we're doing a good job. But it is not the reason that we are doing the work that we do, or the reason for gathering, right? We wish to learn together first. And when we achieve that, when we craft environments in which that is truly possible, healthy and constructive, then healthy community, which is able to outlast any particular cycle of the market, or any particular trend or fashion is the result, but it is not the design goal. And it's really, really important to realize that. One of the corollaries of thinking in this manner is that when you set an explicit purpose or meaning to your gathering or community, it naturally acts as a filter or a constraint. So I watched the really beautiful conversation that you had a few conversations ago about Monsters Island, which I thought was totally fascinating. And when you're just out there to build community and test different ideas about what that means in the modern age in digital media environments, then inevitably you immediately run up into these questions of moderation, for instance, right? And moderation is such a fascinating phenomenon, isn't it? Because it's everything in moderation, including moderation itself. And so moderation is one of these self-recursive phenomena that you can never fully get to the end of, because as soon as you found all of the things you need to moderate, then you find that you need to moderate the method by which you found those things, and it ends up in this constant Ouroboros self-recursive loop. And instead, if you set out from the start to say, look, these are the constraints within which we operate. In Kernel's case, it is we wish to learn stuff together. And immediately what that implies is, look, not everybody is necessarily willing to learn, and not everybody wants to learn the kind of things we're interested in. So that means that there is some kind of limit, a definite constraint that is placed on the kind of community we can create. But you need to ask yourself, well, what is the manner in which we can scale gathering, in which we can scale connection in natural, humane, healthy, and instructive ways? Is it by scaling our brand identity such that Kernel becomes this massive community of billions of people? You know, are we going to onboard the next billion people into crypto? Or is it that we want to craft and create open patterns which people can look at, learn from, and then apply in their own context outside of the brand identity of Kernel in ways which they find to be healthy, constructive, and informative? And that's very much the approach that I wish to explore in this presentation with you all. We're much, much more interested in thinking about how we can propagate healthy patterns through the environment without imposing our own prescriptions or limitations or lenses, and without requiring that these patterns are necessarily associated with some particular company or brand. That kind of scaling allows for us to keep doing the work that we love and to keep connecting with others in the ways that we love without us having to constantly step back and abstract away from our own responsibility. If you look at the way that tech companies traditionally scale, it's by the founders or the early communities or the core contributors continually abstracting away their own responsibility. You know, you hire more people, hand off many of the jobs that you do to others, and take over higher level strategic roles, so to speak. But that kind of movement gets you away from the day-to-day interactions and the responsibility, your ability to respond to others who are a part of your community, who are doing the work with you. And that in and of itself means that you become less and less of an expert in what it is that you're actually doing, right? This links to another thinker who was contemporary with Ivan Illich, a man called Michael Polanyi, who made the very simple point that the people who are closest to the problems are always the most insightful experts about how those problems can be solved. So don't come in from the outside and imply your own framework and solution to problems that might exist in Somalia or Ethiopia. Go to those people, ask them what the problems of their life actually are, and enable them to create solutions of their own accord, right? That was his entire argument. And when we try to scale in a way which abstracts our own responsibility and moves us further away from the problem space, then that by definition decreases our ability to respond creatively to the problems of humans living together, which is both the most generative place we can be, and the one fraught with the most problems, because we're humans and living together is difficult, but also really, really beautiful, and ultimately one of the most worthwhile things which we can explore. So if you go to the next slide, Mark, this is kind of our core philosophy when it comes to thinking about how do we actually craft the learning environments, and how do we craft them in such a way that healthy community emerges. And it's, as I have said, not imposing ourselves, not imposing our own frameworks, beliefs, assumptions, biases, and lenses. It's through trying to help us help each other. Right? It's a really, really critical difference. And you find it cropping up in Web3 all of the time, and also just in the wider technological realm, is that there is this techno-solutionism, which is constantly pushed upon us by those who are not necessarily living in the same contexts and not necessarily aware to the same extent of the nuances and subtleties of problems that people in different parts of the world face. And so what they do is they say, let's build a better framework for governance. Let's give people better tools to govern one another. And this is precisely the opposite to what the anarchic view of the world actually is, right? Anarchy here not meaning the tyranny of structurelessness, anarchy meaning no rulers, not no rules, right? Just no rulers, no people in centralized positions of authority who get to make abstracted decisions that are not closely related to the contexts in which those decisions and the power implied by them are enacted. And the anarchic worldview is one which recognizes that in any moment of help, there is always a double directedness. There is always a reciprocity at work, right? When I help you, even if that seems on the surface to be a one-way street, I myself am helped by you because you, in receiving my help, have satisfied a need that I have, right? Like it may be like existential or like a so-called higher level moral need to be of service to others, to help those in situations of distress when you yourself are not. But you are nevertheless being helped by the people who receive your service. You're in fact being helped deeply, because from a karmic perspective, it is much more difficult to receive than it is to give. This is something that we all know from our own experience. Very, very difficult to receive with grace. Very easy, in fact, to extend a hand to help one another. And so when we hold that in mind, that there is no such thing as a one-way action, there is always gift and interpretation, there is always a movement back and forth, then we can create environments and craft tools which are not as imbalanced, which are not as implicitly informed by this kind of assumption that bakes in a continuing power dynamic between those who have and those who don't, between the privileged and the oppressed, right? Which is this notion that I have and you lack, and I can give you the solution and you only experience problems. This is not true, and we need to be much more conscious of it when crafting and creating tools, because otherwise we just perpetuate the same old power dynamics in ever more efficient ways. In particular, the way that we can do this is through trying to establish reciprocity, right? Reciprocity in everything that we do. And that ironically applies very, very well to learning environments, because any great teacher will tell you that, in fact, when I teach, I learn the most. There is naturally in this action of teaching and learning a movement back and forth in which those who teach learn the most, those who learn actually end up teaching through the way that they respond. There is this natural reciprocity back and forth. And if you go to the next slide, Martin, this is how we ground the pedagogical method that we employ in Kernel, which is centered around these courageous, honest, and intimate dialogues, right? We gather in groups of 4 or 5 around shared topics, and we have what are called juntos, which is a Spanish word for together, and it comes from a particular society for mutual improvement, which was really started by Benjamin Franklin. These kinds of conversations for mutual improvement are based around shared topics, but the whole idea here is that when you can, with courage, bring yourself honestly into intimate conversation with people from all over the world, different walks of life, backgrounds, beliefs, races, languages, sexual orientations, all of it, then you can stand to learn much more, because you're not trying to consume content and then regurgitate it for an examination or an assessment. You're trying to open your mind to as many different perspectives as you possibly can without irritably reaching after fact or certainty in any one direction, right? The mind is like a parachute that only really works when it's open. And in order to truly begin putting down your own biases, to see the ways in which you are conditioned to think about the world, which is higher order learning, right? Not content, but the ability to synthesize, analyze, and then creatively find new solutions which stretch outside of your default modes of seeing and perceiving things, requires being in conversation or dialogue with others. It requires relationship, right? And this is something core to our own perspective and pedagogical method. You know, online learning platforms in general are really, really wonderful at cultivating competence and agency, in the sense that, you know, I can go onto any kind of online learning platform like Khan Academy or Udemy or Free Code Camp, these kinds of places, and I can learn how to code, I can learn how to get into tech, I can learn any number of things very, very easily, because it all takes place in the same medium as which the learning is happening. It's immediate, it provides for rapid feedback. There's all of these really, really neat features about online environments which really amplify competence when learning. And they really amplify agency, because I can log on to these kind of platforms at any time. I don't have to wait for the teacher to come to the class. I can do it at my own speed. But what they really, really lack is relationality. And that's actually what grounds learning in a lifelong manner. If you think back of your own experience of school, or if you were lucky enough to go to university, then you'll know that, like, perhaps some of the concepts you learned, they have stuck. Many of them will not have. The things that last the longest are the relationships. And it's being in relationship with one another which forces us to continuously learn, right? It might not be the same kind of learning as you get in a quantum physics class, but being in relationship, particularly intimate relationship, will teach you ongoing lessons about yourself, about your environment, about the way you react to the world, about how you see things, about how others see things, about creative possibilities based in the spaces between those kinds of perceptions, which allow you to reformat the possibilities of your world. And really what that implies is the ability to listen deeply, right? This notion of horizontal conversations is absolutely critical to how we learn together, and it has turned out to be critical to the healthy community that has emerged as a result of this. Because one of the guiding principles of this community is that it is really by listening actively to one another that we can move conversations closer to the truth. Because when I listen to you, I force you to pay attention to what it is you're saying, and therefore speak more accurately, and therefore closer to the truth. So it is this active kind of listening which actually moves the conversation closer to truth, not anything that you can say. And it's a critical insight, particularly again in our current culture, which promotes what we might call vertical conversation. You know, we only listen to each other insofar as we can pick up a tiny little part of what the other person is saying that we might know more about or be better informed about. And then we focus on that and we try and stack our opinion on top of theirs. And you end up with this vertical stack of opinions that eventually just falls over into the pit of ego. You know, words fall out of people's mouths as easily as possible with as little meaning as necessary. And we can counter that by having this very self-conscious and at first counterintuitive principle that it's in fact by listening that we can truly relate and reformat our perception of one another and the world of which we are a part. It harks back to many of the things that Illich and Polanyi talked about. In particular, you know, like one of the pieces that Illich is really just wonderful about, and you find it across many of the Jesuits and the Franciscans, the more kind of contemplative traditions in Christianity, but also any kind of contemplative tradition across the world, is this recognition that, you know, trying to live by the commandments alone is bound to lead you to a narrow and dogmatic view of the world. We can look at the commandments, we can see which of them actually apply well to living together in a meaningful and loving manner. In the Christian tradition, the one is love thy neighbor as you love yourself, right? Very, very beautiful way of pointing at the manner in which it is possible to realize godliness in relationship to one another, right? But it's not just by the commandments that we can actually craft valuable learning environments and meaningful community. If in fact you're a student of the Bible, you will also know about the Beatitudes, which are, I think, Matthew 5, verses 3 to 12. And Illich talks about these, and some of his pieces is really beautiful. And it is about, you know, like it is the meek who will inherit the earth. It's that part. There are 8 of them, which in some weird way match the Eightfold Noble Path that you find in Buddhism. There's a lot of really interesting parallels. And it is this kind of conscious and intentional recursion where we flip or inverse, right? That first quote that Illich is talking about, we have to find the institutional inverses of educational institutions, of financial institutions, of social institutions, in order to find our way back, in order to remember the kinds of relationships and the kinds of communities which will ground us in meaning and purpose, and the kinds of things that we want to spend a lifetime learning about, that inspire us, that make us passionate. Very importantly, the balancing force to all of this stuff about the Beatitudes and listening and the Eightfold Noble Path is play, right? Because one of the other aspects that is very, very apparent in technological circles and Web3 in particular is that when we set out to build community and then inevitably run into the problems of human beings being in community, we get very serious. You know, we lose our sense of perspective. And we forget that the whole thing is about being able to play nicely together and to play infinitely, right? Infinite games in this sense are premised on 3 basic things, right? It is repeat interactions, win-win games, and low miscommunication. Those 3 things, repeat interactions, win-win games, and low miscommunication, allow us to go on playing increasingly principled and infinite games with one another, where the point is not to win or lose, but to keep the game going, right? The rules are there and they are honored insofar as they allow us to play an ongoing and generative game. When there is the danger of somebody winning or the equally problematic danger of somebody losing, then we change the rules of the game to make sure that it keeps on going, right? This is the awareness that all rules are conventional. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that they're conventional, and any convention is there to be transcended when the heart truly demands it. But in order to know what the heart really demands and not the ego, we have to be able to listen to one another, and we have to be able to listen to ourselves. That is what real and genuine learning environments craft, right? Through listening to one another, through being surprised by one another, through crafting the ability to be surprised in an ongoing fashion in relationship, we can then slowly start to learn how to truly listen to ourselves, how to know what the heart really wants, what our passion truly is, what kinds of things we want to learn about, which extend beyond frameworks of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, but are done autopoetically, which are done for their own sake, right? One dances not to reach any points on the floor. One dances because to dance is a joy, you know, and it's that kind of thing which I'm truly interested in doing. It's that kind of thing which I would love to see more and more of in these learning environments that we build, because I know from experience that it is that kind of autopoetic act which is the ground and seed of all truly sustainable and healthy communities at whatever scale that they exist. So if you go to the next slide. These are our principles. You can find them on our website, and I'm not going to read all of them out because they can be summed up through these 2 very, very simple high-level principles. The first is do no harm. hamsa, or a himsa is what it's called in Hinduism. You can find a very beautiful hand-like symbol which captures this notion of just do no harm. It's so simple, and it's really, really important that it's cast in the negative, right? This is in the Christian or Judaic or Jewish tradition, it's called the golden rule, right? Do not do unto others what you would not want done unto yourself. And again, I cast it in the negative very, very specifically because it is via negativa. It is through being honest about what is not the truth that we can finally carve out the space of the truth without ever actually pointing at it in a prescriptive or dogmatic fashion. So, you know, like when you cast it as like, do unto others what you would want done unto yourself, it was this phrase that was used to justify the Crusades, for instance, because all of the Crusaders were like, I would love to be killed by a man of God rather than a heathen, so we can justify the Crusades. Whereas if you say, do not do unto others what you would not want done unto yourself, you immediately guard against that kind of stuff. And as I say, move away from prescription and dogma and further into the celebration of the ongoing mystery of each moment and of every life. So do no harm and play infinitely. Right? It's not so serious after all, just like Martin's dog is showing us at the moment. It really, really, really isn't all of that serious. This is a deep insight from the Zen tradition, from people like Alan Watts. You'll find beautiful lectures about this particular notion. You know, he says the life is centered around 5 things. He explains them, and he's like, there's also a 6th question, which is it serious? Is it really all that serious after all? And I think that if you're out to understand what healthy community looks like, it is one which is premised on a principled approach to life, which acknowledges the need for respect and courtesy, for the ability to see each person as a full and worthy human being, but nevertheless, which doesn't lose that inner spark, that inner joy, that playfulness, that desire to dance, to sing, to make music, to love one another, to cry, to do all of these human things which are uniquely ours to do in this one and beautiful and precious life that we have. So if you go to the next slide, these are our principles, and the last few slides that I have for you are really like quite a lot more speculative because we're still in the process of building all of this. But we've been running Kernel, as Martin said, for just over 2 years now. We've run 6 blocks and 1 other for Filecoin, so 7 blocks. About 1,500 people have been through our peer learning environments. We've ourselves have learned an enormous amount because that's why we set it up the way that we did and what we really want to keep doing. And for the last 2 years, the back end of Kernel has been duct taped together with a whole bunch of no-code tools, including Typeform, Airtable, Notion, all of these easy to use and convenient tools which have allowed us to, at a very low friction and low cost, support this kind of environment as we have experimented and learned ourselves. And now, having done that for 2 years, we feel that we're in a position where we understand enough about what we really need and the problems that we actually have to start building more serious tools of our own to get there and to serve better and increasingly constructive, healthy, and wholesome learning environments. The form that this infrastructure takes is rather simple, but we think quite novel. So I thought I'd just spend kind of 5 minutes discussing it, which is that at its heart, each person who joins Kernel will create their own non-custodial wallets. We began with a wallet because it is the primary educational tool in Web3. And when we think about wallets, we're actually calling ours a portal because the word wallet doesn't really capture what keyrings enable. When we think about these pieces of software in an educational environment rather than a strictly financial one, the way in which the interface is designed and the manner in which it will be used is radically different. So the wallet that we have, which you can find at staging.wallets.kernel.community, if you create one now and forgive the still in progress UI, you will notice, for instance, that the first thing you are presented with once your wallet is created is not a numeric balance, right? It is a page that describes all of the different things you can do and learn with your wallets in Kernel. This is not just financial. It's not just about inspecting transactions, contracts, writing your own contracts, having an IDE, getting access to a faucet, all of the things that you would ordinarily expect, but also all of the kernel-specific features that you can access, given that this wallet talks to two other pieces of our infrastructure, one of which is a simple key value storage service that we have running, which mimics the blockchain in its structure, simple keys and values, but allows us to extend and ensure the privacy of people who go through kernel without putting absolutely everything on chain. The idea here is that when you are careful and intentional about your particular use of data and what needs to be on-chain and what needs to be off-chain, what needs to be learned about on the network and what can be learned about in a more private and safe community, then you can do all sorts of interesting things. Like, for instance, our wallet, it's non-custodial. So if people lose the keys, there is indeed no way in which we can help them recover funds associated with that wallet. But because your wallet is linked to other data associated with you about your kernel profile or adventures that you go on through kernel, events that you hold or attend, conversations that you're a part of, different kinds of in-person events or retreats that we do, that data is linked to your wallets, but it can be linked to a new wallet. So if you lose the keys to your wallet, you don't lose access to everything associated with kernel, just the things that are associated with your on-chain existence. These kinds of finer distinctions also allow for us to experiment with things like community recovery and some of the more experimental ideas, which are just now being able to being talked about in papers like Decentralized Society and various other places, including AKASHA. And the final thing is like an auth service, which is what the wallet will speak to when fetching data from the storage service. This auth service is itself a wallet, which is kind of interesting and not something that we've discussed before with AKASHA. And it allows for us to not only have a fine-grained insight into what data we share within the kernel community, and I'll explain how that works on the next slide, but also to federate with other communities in incredibly easy and efficient manners, so that we don't need to issue credentials, VCs or DIDs through kernel. We can in fact do far more contextual, helpful and dynamic sharing with communities like AKASHA and others that don't require some noun-like DID or object, but rather allow us to explore identity and who you are in an ongoing, dynamic and verb-like way. The way that this looks within kernel is these concentric circles. And for those of you who've been working in community, you'll like this notion of community as concentric circles is very common in Web3 especially, but also in technology more broadly. But what I want you to notice about the way that kernel thinks about it, and in fact the way that it is coded in our infrastructure, is that it is precisely the inverse of what you would ordinarily see, which has core contributors at the middle, then active supporters, then participants, and then perhaps like the audience or other people loosely associated with the community moving outwards. But in kernel, it's the exact opposite. New fellows, people who just joined the community, are in the center of the community, right? So they're in the middle, and then you move outwards from there as you become an alum, as you go on to become a guide for future kernel fellows or a mentor, as you go on to lead your own guilds, which are sort of technical specific tracks about gaming, NFTs, DeFi, DAOs, any number of other things, also including mindful movement, meditation, cooking, dancing, these kinds of things. And then stewards are on the outside. They are the people who are actually most connected with the rest of the ecosystem, the ones who can make sure that your move out into the wider world of Web3 is seamless, while also playing a protective role for those who are new to the community, who have just landed. And in this sense, people are meant to grow out of the community, right? It's not an enclosure. We are not here to sit around a table and chant one of us, one of us, one of us, right? We want people to come into kernel, learn the lessons that we have to teach, and move on, grow up, grow into the rest of the community, right? Because if we're a learning community in which people get stuck, that means that we're not teaching the lessons very, very well, right? And the whole idea of trying to enclose people in a fixed identity, a fixed label, a fixed brand, a fixed identity, that is again, once again counter to anarchic principles, and it's counter to what healthy community and healthy relationships are actually like, i.e. they change, they grow, they alter over time. And if we don't build communal structures in which that is possible, and which is in fact the premise of the community, then we're inevitably going to end up in toxic and wasteful situations. So the concentric circles model is a wonderful way to think about community, but we need its inverse. Again, we need to be able to play with it and recognize that it's not about falling down into the middle where you can be part of an exclusive band of core contributors. It's about growing up out of the middle and into the rest of the ecosystem so you can contribute to the wider value flows of information, money, and whatever else is going on. So if you go to the last slide, I think. Yeah, this is our infrastructure. You can find it, it's all open source. You can see here all of the different web apps that we have. We call it a family of focused web apps, all of which serve a particular purpose within the kernel community, from the wallets to the websites to events that we host, to projects that people do, to the profile of each member, to the groups of which they are a part. We have this notion that perhaps the group is the fundamental economic unit and not the individual. And so groups form an important aspect of, again, our core infrastructure and the core conceptual apparatus by which this stuff is put together. I know that I've spoken for a long time, so I won't say too much more about that, but it's all open source. It's all written in React, which is not necessarily the greatest language, but it is the most widely spoken. And we chose it specifically to make ease of contribution our top priority. So if you are a web developer of any kind and you have previous experience with React, we would be very, very happy to play around and see if you would like to contribute to a new and different kind of manner of thinking about patterned, principled, open source communities, which might be applied across contexts. And then the final slide is one more quote, this time from David Grieber, from in fact the first book that he ever wrote, which is called Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology. And in this book, he refuses to give an exact description of what anarchy is, or the critical or theoretical infrastructure by which it operates. That's why it's these fragments, stories collected from around the world, different places, different contexts, to try and give you a felt and experiential taste of what it might be like to live in a world without rulers. And this is really what he's saying in this quote. And the thing that I really wanted to pull out here was that the radical intellectual, the one who is able to think in a way which gets to the roots of the problems that we currently experience in our own lives and in the way that we relate to one another, that radical intellectual does not critique things from some kind of objective distance. He in fact, or she in fact, gets involved bodily in the methods of organization, in the praxis in which they're interested in, tries to elucidate its principles and then offer those back as a gift, not as a prescription, but as a gift, as a contribution, as an ongoing act of participation. And if we are here to continuously give gifts to one another, to receive gracefully who other people are and how they perceive the world, and then to contribute our own perceptions back in an ongoing, honest and open dialogue, then I think we can have the kind of constant dialogue that moves us between a deep ethnographic, anthropological, accurate and clear view of the world, which is nevertheless tinged by utopia, tinged by a way of living well together, which is not about repressing the darker sides of our nature, but about being in relationship and finding ways of loving and learning from one another, no matter what is currently taking place. So that was it. Thank you so much for dealing with the background noise in Barcelona. I really, really appreciate your time, and we have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Andy. This was an amazing, inspiring presentation, a breath of fresh air, and thank you very much for this, and wonderful. I've seen there, I couldn't look at the chat at the same time really well, but please step forward if you want to ask a question. I've seen Philip, Mitko.
I can, Andy, thank you so much for that overview. I mean, trying to find flaw in it, but there isn't. I can't see a flaw in it. It's just as a beautiful thing, the way you approached the community, the mutual respect. I'm loving it, if I'm honest, but you know that already. I have one question, which is what are usually referred to as KPIs or metrics of success. Do you have any?
Okay, Philip, maybe can you repeat the end? It wasn't.
Yes, I was interested in whether Kernel has any metrics of its success, you know, in that sort of growth hacking sort of way, which I know what I'm introducing because it's growth hacking is counter to everything that Andy's just said. So I'm just interested in how metrics might feature in the progression of Kernel.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and one that we're not good at answering, which is not to say that KPIs are not valuable. I think that they are, and it's a lesson that we're continuously learning about, like, where is the balance between having like objective, measurable, well-defined understandings of what success might mean, and nevertheless allowing for nuance around like a continuously evolving sense of that success. So like one place where it is for sure very clear for us is in applications, right? We know from the number of applications we receive per block how Kernel is perceived in the wider ecosystem. And by breaking those applications down into like different categories, we can understand whether we're continuously doing things well or have perhaps fallen off the pace a little bit. So for instance, in block 5, we had 2,600 applications, I think, which was enormous and was a sign that, you know, we had really begun to build a lot of momentum, and that the particular narrative which we're trying to propagate about these open environments for learning had reached an increasing number of people, and that like a number of these people were just people that we simply couldn't say no to. So that's like a good measure of success for us, is like how many applications are we getting and how many can we just absolutely not say no to. So like in block 5, we had, you know, generally we aimed for 250 people, we had 400 people, not because we weren't incredibly specific and precise about the kind of person that we wanted in the block, simply that, you know, we couldn't say no to all of these incredible people. Now, after block 6, this empty block, having had like slightly less activity, especially on social media, the number of applications has dropped, as has the number of, you know, really, really like mind-blowing applicants. But that is also, I think, a function of current market conditions, and it's really interesting to see how the wider environment plays into the number of applications we get per block. You know, like the other truth of this, Philip, is that for us, it's mostly about, you know, like how many people hosted a dinner in their own home, how many people hosted a get-together in their home city, how many conversations were organized spontaneously during the block, how many games were played, were there any new games that people played which taught us something different about how we might relate. These kinds of things are, you know, stuff that we very much do care about and do pay attention to. So like those are important and something that we actively try to foster and model so that other people can feel comfortable doing it themselves. And then like the ultimate metric, especially for Vivek, is how many weddings do we get invited to? I think we're at 2.
I can't promise a wedding, but everyone on this call is invited around mine next time you're in Amsterdam for dinner. Just put that out there.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that kind of stuff, right? It's like much more on the like what are the good proxies for measuring healthy moments of relationship? And while these are always just proxies, it's like, okay, these, like how many people organized conversations of their own accord? How many people hosted things of their own accord? those are really, really, really good indicators and things that we are very aware of and actively try to promote, not through like telling people, oh, you should do this, because that would be coercive, but through like in the first 2 weeks of the block, doing it ourselves, modeling how it can look, and then like hopefully people kind of pick it up and run with it in their own time.
So thank you. I see there's Charles just raised his hand, and we had also Mitko who asked a question. Charles, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. It's more of a comment. I hope you can hear me because I'm out amongst noise. But I just want to comment on, first of all, thank you everyone, Andy, Martin, and Akasha, and Kernel, much love. Just an observation that it made a lot of difference for Kernel, the Kernel stewards, and to be intentional about cross-pollinating between the blocks. I think in particular, and more recently in the block 6, but in general, I think that that awareness and intention has made an enormous difference in my career. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and it's a point well made. It's something that we're kind of constantly thinking about, and thinking about like what the most healthy ways are in which that can occur. But you know, from your own experience with both actual gardening and community gardening, that kind of cross-pollination is what produces truly novel and interesting seeds, which are well adapted to new and potentially more harsh environments, which can grow and flourish in the sorts of soil which we now have to deal with. And it is, something that I think a lot about is like cross-pollination, the influence that has like epigenetically as we learn, you know, each time we host a new block, we ourselves learn a lot more about how to host. We learn a lot more about like pertinent and important lessons to emphasize for people going through this as a means of getting into Web3 more healthily. And those lessons can then be fed back into previous generations, previous blocks, and used in ways which enable all of us to create like a more abundant and resilient community garden, which is a term that I am shamelessly stealing from you and for which I am enormously grateful.
It's great. It's maybe nice to mention I had Lorenzo from the AKASHA Hub visit me here, Barcelona Hub, and the AKASHA Barcelona is actually deeply involved in also creating a community garden at the moment, right? It's interesting how the things come together, and community gardens are a great thing. I might do one here as well in the mountains. I've seen Mitko ask a great question before, and I might just quickly repeat it myself here. It was about Andy, how you deal with the cultivate relationships and deal with the shortenism that is prevailing in the crypto world. So it is. I picked this up. I took it out of Mitko's words. This question, Mitko, you may want to also say something. I just want to say what fascinated me about Kernel was really the fact that you could see people engaging in very deep and thoughtful conversations. Sometimes you were surprised that I was really surprised by also, you know, that this happened. So maybe Andy, can you say something about how do you make people get so open themselves so much and become so thoughtful, you know, that you have a 2 a.m. conversation with amazing people working on some DeFi protocol ultimately, you know?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. The first and I think most important thing is that you don't make people do anything. It's just it doesn't work. It's a route to, you know, either dictatorship or frustration, and most likely frustration. And in fact, dictatorship is just a longer route to frustration and probably the guillotine. So I think that the deeper insight here, right, is that the most that any person can do is model what they want to see in the world by living it themselves first, right? It has to be that way, and it really deeply has to be lived that kind of insight and the work required in order to live a more thoughtful, examined, contemplative life has to be primary and prior to the ability to propagate it in community. It requires, that an emptying, right? Like, again, I've been touching a little bit on the Christian tradition today, and like there is this wonderful word in Christianity. It's called kenosis, K-E-N-O-S-I-S, kenosis, right? And it's the word that is used often to describe Jesus on the cross, right? Like it's this complete emptying of the self and humility, right? To be humble before one's situation and to be humble before God. And to be humble before the cross of our lives, which is the symbol of contradiction and paradox, the way in which we are at once aware of that which is beyond our little self, right, which grounds us and gives us meaning, which is the heart of this beating and ongoing life, and yet nevertheless doomed in a very beautiful, wonderful, humorous and tragic way to live out our particular and unique life, right? And that kind of humility needs to take root deeply in the heart in order to then be reflected in a healthy way in community, right? It's like there's lots of like tips that I've given throughout this presentation, like use self-recursive methods like listening rather than speaking, emphasize how you have to love other people as you would love yourself, how you do not do unto others what you would not want done unto yourself, how humility is the grounding and guiding principle of any interaction. All of these are wonderful like words and concepts around which to organize, and they do help a lot bring people closer toward having like a more contemplative attitude when they enter any particular shared space. But the deeper truth of it is that you need to be living that yourself. You need to be a living example, right? This was Gandhi's whole thing. There's a story about Gandhi, which I often tell because I love it. He's going up north during partition. It's a terribly violent time in Indian and Pakistani history. And he's taking a train and people are begging him not to go, begging him. Right? They say, if you go north, Mahatma, you're going to die. They will kill you there. And he insists. He said, I'm needed there, and that is where I'm going. And he gets on this train, and he's leaving the station, and there's a reporter there waiting. And he yells out, he says, Mahatma, Mahatma, what are your last words? Right? And Mahatma like disappears inside the train, and they think that he hasn't answered. But as the train leaves the station, he throws out this piece of fast food packaging. And they run and get it, and on it he has scribbled, my life is my message, right? And I think it's one of the most profound things, because my life is my message is precisely what I'm saying here. You have to live what you want to see in the world. You know, the world doesn't need more people who are doing what others think they need to do. We need more people who have come alive, who are doing what they most uniquely desire in this world. But fascinatingly, in this story, you know, like the medium is the message. And Mahatma takes this media, this fast food wrapper, which is so symbolic of our fast food attitude to life and our fast food culture, and he turns it into the site of ultimate signification, right? And that's what you can do if you're really living your principles. It actually doesn't matter the precise content of them, right? What matters is that they are fully realized in your heart. Because if you are, then you can take a fast food wrapper and you can turn it into the most profound message for all humanity, right? It's this like, through being totally and fully honest about who and what you are and the limitations that you face in this time and space and body, you can touch upon the transcendent, that which is not you. But you don't get there by going for the transcendent. You get there by being honest and courageous and humble about the fact of your own life. And if that's the case, then it sets others free to do the same. And that's been like the most profound insight for me out of these conversations, is that like when I am in a state where I'm trying to, you know, impress or teach other people or play this role where I somehow know more, then inevitably it ends up being quite a boring conversation, except for my ego, which loves hearing the sound of my own voice. Right? It's thoroughly enjoyed the last hour, by the way. But when I am in a space where I'm really listening to others, where I'm asking good questions rather than piling on my own opinions, then I I can be surprised. I can be surprised ultimately by grace, which is the biggest surprise, right? It's got nothing to do with us. It is completely undeserved. And occasionally, in moments of real community, of real gatheredness, we can come to be surprised by that which is at once realized through each and every one of us, but simultaneously transcends, simultaneously pulls us out of our specific contextual suffering into, you know, what is called in Buddhism like existence, consciousness, bliss, right? Nirvana, whatever name you want to give it. There's many different ones.
Wonderful, thank you. It's great to listen to your ego voice, Andy. Really, it's wonderful, and there's so many insights that I think we need to process from this hour. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, and I just see we are already beyond the hour, so we just posted here in the chat also a link to a forum where we invite you to follow up if there's other comments you want to make or questions or continue this conversation. Then sign up there, please. You're welcome, and see you there. And I think with this we'll wrap this. And Andy, you may freely roam the streets of Barcelona again and meet with your partner now, and have a great evening, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Go on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was great.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Andy. Great talk.